Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is actually kind of an interesting subject, and this is how to think. Now, this also came out of my first semester teaching. We talk a lot in education about the importance of critical thinking, but we never actually tell you what that means. So I was teaching my first class. I put up a question. I said, let's do a critical thinking exercise. Students were all like, oh, yeah, we love critical thinking. So I put up the question, and they all stared at me blankly. And I was like, well, do you have some rules, some system for how you're supposed to critically think, something the school has taught you? And they said, well, no. And I thought back, and that's the same as in my experience. We tell you throughout high school, even throughout college, how important critical thinking is, but we never actually tell you how to think critically. Fortunately, in law school, basically the only thing they do is spend 3 years teaching you how to think critically using a particular method called the IRAC method. So what I'm going to do now is save you all $100,000 in law school, and I'm going to teach you how to IRAC, how to think like a lawyer. So IRAC stands for Issue, Rule, Application, Conclusion, and it's a system of thought that helps you clearly identify issues and reach a conclusion based upon a logical thought process. Now, IRAC is also, interestingly, an organizational tool for writing. This is going to be very important for you moving forward in high school and in college. A lot of what professors are looking for when they read your essays is organization. You can have the best ideas imaginable, but if we can't figure out what you're trying to say, if we can't find the parts we're looking for, then you can't get a good grade. So you should kind of put this IRAC in your back pocket when you're sitting in a history classroom and the teacher asks you what issues led to the Civil War. This might be a good method to pull out and sort of organize your ideas very, very clearly. So 4 steps: issue, rule, application, conclusion. So first off, issue. First thing we have to do is figure out what we're talking about here. So identifying the issue in real life is very, very hard. It's one of the reasons lawyers get paid a lot of money, because we're able to sit down and listen to somebody talk for an hour, and we're able to come out of that conversation with 4 main issues. For most people, you have to train up over a long period of time. For our course, we're almost always just going to give you the issue. If we're on a discussion board and I want you to talk about something, I'm going to say, talk about X. I'm not going to make you go digging through a fact pattern for it. But it's worth noting that this issue spotting and issue crafting is a very important part of political debates. Politicians love to define the issue in a way that maybe it shouldn't be defined. This is a good example of straw man arguments where the politician will come out and make some statement that's not really an accurate representation of the other side's opinions and then argue against it. Well, what they did was they changed the issue a little bit, and that led to a logical conclusion for that not correct issue. By doing that, it looks like they're making a really strong argument when frequently they're not. So when you identify the issue, basically what you're doing is looking at the fact pattern, finding out what they're really talking about. But how we define it is frequently going to control the outcome. Now let's look at the example I'm using for this lecture, which is the death penalty constitutional? So that's a very straightforward issue. Is the death penalty constitutional? So the next thing we have to do is, once we have an issue, we have to find the rule. You have to find and state what rule controls on that issue. Now, there's 2 potential sources for these rules: internal rules and external rules. Now, as a lawyer, most of what I deal with are external rules. When somebody asks me something, they're not asking how I feel about it. They're asking me what the law says about it. What does the Constitution say? What does the statute say? What does some judge 20 years ago say about this? That's an external source. In most of what we do in life, we're actually looking at internal sources. We're looking at, how do you feel? What do you believe should happen? Even when we talk about politics, most of the time we're asking you, is this right or is this wrong? And those are internal questions. In this course, one of the main things I want you to get out of it is an understanding of these internal rules and sort of the creation of a toolbox of rules. Instead of just walking into a voting booth and kind of shooting from the hip, doing whatever you feel right at the time, I want you to sort of refine your moral toolbox. And so when you pull it out, you can kind of say, well, I believe this, therefore, looking at that fact pattern, this rule should apply, and I can reach a logical conclusion. Now, most people don't go through that. Most people just sort of respond emotionally. But that's something that we try to avoid. So what about in our case? Question was, is the death penalty constitutional? Am I asking you for an internal or an external rule? Well, in this case, I'm asking for something external, right? Clearly in the question, I'm saying, is it constitutional? So does it comport with the U.S. Constitution? So that is external. It doesn't care how you feel about it. It cares what the Constitution says about it. Now, what if instead I had said, should we have the death penalty? Is that internal or external? Well, in that case, it's an internal rule, right? In that case, we're saying, how do you feel about it? So that's internal. So we're talking about the Constitution. Where do we go? We go to the 8th Amendment, and we will talk about this a lot more later in the semester. But basically, part of the 8th Amendment says no cruel and unusual punishment. And so this gets us to another important point, which is sub-IRAC. Now, a lot of the times this will happen. You'll have an issue. You'll go and identify the rule. But within that rule, there's another issue you have to answer. So, for example, in this case, is the death penalty cruel and unusual punishment? You have to be able to define what cruel and unusual punishment is, which means you have to kind of go back to that opening question. Is it an internal or external question? That can be somewhat difficult. The Constitution doesn't define cruel and unusual, so it's not necessarily external in that point, but we look at case law. But the case law can change, and so you can make a solid argument. So in this case, is the death penalty cruel and unusual? That's, for our purposes, that's a judgment call for you, but that's ultimately going to control what happens. So we have our issue, is the death penalty constitutional? We have our rule, no cruel and unusual punishment. So is the death penalty constitutional? Constitution says no cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the next step is to apply the fact pattern and the rule. We call this application. So in this case, we're just saying the death penalty, we determined, is cruel and unusual punishment, and the Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Simple enough application. So we're just taking in the application. This is the part where most people get lost, because issue, you're more or less copying down. I gave you rule, you're looking for a source, or you're just stating your opinion. Application can be a little bit more complicated, but all you're doing is saying, how do the rule and the issue interact? You're applying the issue and the rule to each other. And so in our case, if we determine that the death penalty was cruel and unusual, then we say the death penalty Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Finally, you reach a conclusion. Just saying, do the facts satisfy the rule? Issue, is the death penalty constitutional? Rule, excessive bail shall not be required, blah, 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 nor cruel and unusual punishment be inflicted. Application, the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. The Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Conclusion, therefore, the death penalty is unconstitutional. Now, what's so great about IRAC is that it really becomes difficult to attack. You see, when you follow IRAC, your conclusion is always correct if your issue and rule are correct. And so in order to attack someone who has correctly IRAC'd a situation, you can't attack their conclusion. You have to explain why the premises that this conclusion is based on are faulty. Because as long as their conclusion is supported by the other two steps, their conclusion is correct. Now, this is why lawyers are good at arguing. This is why most politicians are lawyers, and lawyers are good at arguing. Because it makes it seem like you're always right, even if your conclusion doesn't really make sense in the situation. So this is a good way to sort of manipulate people. It's a good way to sort of control an argument. It's a good way to win a fight, oral fight, because you are able to control how the argument flows. Now, I've attached a number of examples. I like these examples. I'm going to post the slides for you, and I want you to kind of think through these examples because they really are a good way to work your way through this question. So I'm not going to require you to write these up. This is just to get you thinking about IRAC, but I would strongly encourage you to do so because IRAC is a skill that's going to come up again and again. I'm going to ask you to think critically in this course and also throughout your high school, the rest of your high school and college careers. You're going to be responsible for thinking critically about these things, and so it's definitely worth your while. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Post this information online. If you have any questions about IRAC, please let me know. But I would recommend spending a little bit of time with these examples to try to get a better feel for it. Thank you.